Should see some people coming in. Great. Got Marianne there. Good evening. Hi, Donna. Hi, Virginia. Hello, Kevin. Welcome. Good evening, Alexa. So we got a few folks tuning in here. If you'd like, you're more than welcome to put in the chat line where you're joining in from. It's always kind of fun to see where people are tuning in from. Great. Okay. Well, there might be a few more people joining us here tonight, but we will get started. So good evening, everyone. And my name is Natalie, and on behalf of the White Museum, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. Tonight's talk features Daniel Meister, who is a Lillian Agnes Jones Fellowship recipient and the author of The Racial Mosaic, A Prehistory of Canadian Multiculturalism. Now, before we begin, I would like to address a couple of things. So just a quick reminder that we are on webinar. So this means that we and the other attendees cannot see or hear you. However, we will have a question and answer period after Daniel's presentation tonight, and please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or the chat box, and we can address your questions there, or feel free to add comments as well. I'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, the Mountain Cree, and Métis. And with that, I would like to now invite Elizabeth Kundert-Cameron, who is our head of archives and library, to introduce Daniel tonight.
Hello, I am honored to introduce Daniel Meister to you tonight. He's going to be speaking, as Natalie said, about his recently published book, The Racial Mosaic, A Prehistory of Canadian Multiculturalism. The Racial Mosaic was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2021 and has since been shortlisted for the 2022 Wilson Book Prize, which is awarded by the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History. Daniel is a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Brunswick. He was granted a Doctor of Philosophy and History in 2020 from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and a Master of Arts in History in 2014, also from Queen's. In 2019, that's when we got to know him. He was awarded the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies Lillian Agnes Jones Fellowship. The intention of this fellowship is to foster original research on Western Canada with at least 1 month of focused research utilizing the collections of the White Museum. Daniel's topic was A Red Tile in the Canadian Mosaic, Indigenous Peoples and John Murray Gibbon's Cultural Pluralism. In choosing Daniel as a fellow, we hoped that Daniel would delve into the archival holdings and provide new insights into John Murray Gibbon, who we knew through his involvement with the Canadian Pacific Railway and his friendships with local residents, and my personal favorite, his parodies of the Trail Riders of the Canadian Rockies songs in the Trail Rocky, in their songbook. So I quite like John Murray Gibbon. We were not disappointed with what he was able to discover. In January 2020, Daniel arrived in Banff, and for 5 weeks, he worked closely with reference archivist librarian Lindsay Sticalco in researching over 15 archival fonds of photographs, text, and sound recordings, plus publications from the archives library. He was able to locate records between Gibbon and various individuals living in Banff about the Trail Riders of the Canadian Rockies, Skyline Trail Hikers of the Canadian Rockies, Banff Indian Days, and Highland gatherings at the Banff Springs Hotel, as well as information pertaining to Gibbon's induction as an honorary Stoney Nakoda chief in 1944, and a listing of the Indigenous guides used in the trail riders of the Canadian Rockies in the mid-1940s. When Daniel's book arrived in the mail about a month ago, I was eager to read more specifically on what he had learned, not only from the White Museum's collections, but also through their primary and secondary resources he'd researched in other archives. I was amazed, but not surprised, at the depth of his research, and spent a lot of time referring back and forth from his chapters to the 130 pages of notes and bibliography that he provided. Thank you so much, Daniel. I've already identified some books in your bibliography that were missing in our archives library, and thank you. We will be adding to our collection. This book is really timely in looking at Canada's historical vision of itself as a beacon of multiculturalism. It's an excellent book and I highly recommend it. That said, please welcome Daniel Meister.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Hopefully I'll be able to live up to that. I'd like myself to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from New Brunswick, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples, which is covered under treaties of peace and friendship. And I'd also like to thank all those who made this research possible, especially all the staff at the White Museum, with special thanks to the team at the Library and Archives. I would also like to thank Nakota tribal historian Buddy Wesley for his help, as well as the members of Gibbons' extended family who helped me with my research. Though I should stress that the biographical sketch of Gibbon in the book and the rest of my analysis about his activities is in no way or any sense authorized. Finally, I just have to say how grateful I was to receive a Lillian Agnes Jones Fellowship and how much I enjoyed my time at the White Museum. I kind of selfishly hope to come back and deliver a talk in person because it's such a beautiful place and it was such a wonderful experience. But I'm happy for this format, which allows folks that might ordinarily not be able to join us. So thanks to everyone who's listening tonight. I have a lot to say and probably not enough time to say it in, so I'll just jump in here. On the 7th of October, 1971, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau rose in the House of Commons and delivered a brief speech announcing the new policy of multiculturalism within a bilingual framework. And 2 days later, he elaborated on this policy in a speech to the Ukrainian Canadian community, who had been some of the most vocal advocates of such a policy. And towards the end of his remarks, Trudeau said, "The fabric of Canadian society is as resilient as it is colorful. It is a multicultural society. It offers to every Canadian the opportunity to fulfill his own cultural instincts and to share those from other sources. This mosaic pattern and the moderation which it includes and encourages makes Canada a very special place." The question remains, of course, how we got to this moment. Given how important the policy of official multiculturalism has become to Canadian national identity, it is somewhat perplexing how poorly understood this history remains. Of the few academics who've examined the topic, some have suggested it is simple. So, for instance, one has said simply that Trudeau is the first theorist of Canadian multiculturalism. But the images and the metaphors that Trudeau employed when he was talking about multiculturalism, such as the colorful fabric and the mosaic pattern, I think are themselves indicators that this was not the first expression of this type of thinking in Canada. And so this raises a number of questions. Who were the individuals responsible for promoting more culturally pluralist ways of thinking before this period? What were they working towards? And how did they understand their respective efforts and projects? And so to get at this history of ideas, my book takes a historical biographical approach and explores the life and thought of three Canadian public intellectuals who were responsible for some of the earliest and most notable expressions of this cultural pluralism, as I call it. And so these are Watson Kirkconnell, Robert England, and John Murray Gibbon. Now, because of the constraints of time, and in order to best examine the role of the Rockies in this specific history, my talk tonight is going to focus on just one of these individuals, John Murray Gibbon. But before I get into his life and thought, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the arc of the argument in the book more broadly. So the nation known as Canada today began as a series of settler colonies that were established on Indigenous lands. with the bulk of the earliest colonists coming from France and Britain. And the British dream was to have a colony composed exclusively of loyal English subjects, but this was made impossible on account of insufficient immigration from the home country after the 1850s. After the country's confederation in 1867, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's national policy was crafted in part by the belief that in order to prevent American expansion, the West had to be settled, which is to say that Indigenous peoples need to be dispossessed of their lands, and these lands need to be taken and inhabited by Europeans. So basically from coast to coast. So in order to achieve this objective, overall immigration to Canada had to increase quite dramatically, which led the government to accept immigrants from a wide variety of cultural and religious backgrounds. So specifically in around 1900, you can see here that Canada began welcoming huge numbers of immigrants and predominantly continental Europeans. And so this is a massive spike, as you can see, and it's kind of, it was record setting. And this continued from about 1900 really until the beginning of the First World War. And so these are very dramatic demographic changes, and they made a lot of Anglo-Canadians quite uneasy, which in turn made immigration policy even more controversial. And a crucial part of these debates was the degree to which certain immigrants were able to assimilate to Canadian culture and to what degree they ought to be expected to do so. And so assimilation of this, of course, in this sense refers to the process of abandoning one's own culture, being forced to abandon one's own culture and adopting instead the society's dominant culture. And so the loudest voices in this debate proclaimed that continental European immigrants were inferior to English immigrants and that their admission ought to be restricted. These debates seem completely foreign to us now. For example, at that time, Ukrainian immigrants were pointed to by many as examples of poor quality immigrants, whereas now there's a broad support for the acceptance of an unlimited number of Ukrainian refugees to come to Canada. So you can see here a clipping from 1929 when an Anglican bishop in Saskatchewan made a series of, quite inflammatory statements about continental Europeans versus today, some polling suggesting the widespread acceptance. So there's a lot of unfamiliarity with this, this particular history, and this unfamiliarity has led some academics to conclude that although a lot of the commentators during this period were using the language of race, that these debates were really about culture, which cultures were compatible with Canada. And so one of the arguments my book makes early on is that this definitely wasn't the case, that we need to take these commentators seriously and at face value when they use the language of race. This is what they're talking about. And so the idea of race and biological races has long been proven to be mistaken. But in this period, race was a common sense and very scientific idea for many Canadians. And I think a lot of people today would be familiar with the racial classifications that were developed in centuries past, which divided the world into basically 3 or 4 main races, supposedly by skin color. So red, white, yellow, and black. So these are kind of the crude racial typologies of the period, meaning, red for Indigenous peoples, yellow for Asian, black for African, and white for European. But what's even less familiar to people today is the full complexity of these racial hierarchies. So from the outset, Europeans are very concerned with considering themselves as white and dividing between white and non-white, but they also use the idea of race to divide between European nations themselves and even between members of the same European nations. So they believed actually that there were multiple white races that could be ranked hierarchically and could be identified using physical features other than skin color, such as head shape, stature, and eye and hair color. And the most common classification I have here suggested that there were 3 main European races, which in order of superiority to inferiority were Nordic, Mediterranean, and Alpine. So you can see here at the top, there's kind of that the white, non-white division. And then below that, these 3 main white races. And then below that, it got more and more complicated. But the short of it is that that there was this particular hierarchy, and that Anglo-Saxons belonged to this better white race. So, I mean, if we're being perfectly honest, these ideas seem completely bizarre to us today. But at the period we're talking about, and from the early 20th century, from roughly 1900 to the 1920s and 30s, These ideas had huge purchase, and they were at the heart of the debates about immigration and assimilation in Canada. They were believed to be scientific, and because they were believed to have such weight, both those fighting for and against the admission of continental European immigrants relied on race in their arguments. So here's just a handful of clippings from Canadian newspapers just showing that this type of racial thinking was quite common, and on a variety of subjects here, poor living conditions in Toronto being attributed to different races. So both those for and against continental European immigration were using ideas about race, and my book goes into a lot more detail about these ideas. But one of the things that's most important for our discussion tonight is that both sides agreed on one thing. So although there was discussion about which European groups were acceptable for immigration to Canada, there was agreement on the idea that all those considered non-white were unacceptable, and also that Indigenous peoples in Canada needed to be assimilated into Anglo or Franco-Canadian society, depending on the region in which they lived. So for instance, in the works of Watson Kirkconnell and Robert England, these essentially ignored all Canadians who were considered non-white and argued that most Canadians were of European descent, and that this itself gave hope for the idea that Canada could have national unity because there was racial homogeny. And although they praised, the various European cultures, which, it was controversial in this period, they made no attempt to appreciate African, Asian, or Indigenous cultures in Canada, and actually, in many cases, made some disparaging jokes at their expense. Gibbons' relationship with and portrayal of these groups, and especially Indigenous peoples, was comparatively complex, in part due to the time that he spent in the Banff region. But despite the ties that he forged, he would later exclude Indigenous peoples from his famous Mosaic. And so the remainder of the talk will examine these contradictions, as well as the logic and benefits and limitations of the vision of cultural pluralism that he developed. So John Murray Gibbon was born on the 12th of April, 1875 in Ceylon, or what is now Sri Lanka. His father had migrated there from Scotland to grow coffee and later tea, and he stayed there until his retirement. John Murray's tenure was not so long, unfortunately. At 4 years old, he was packed off to Scotland, where he and 3 siblings boarded with a Protestant minister's family in Aberdeen. Gibbon was a bright student. He eventually went on to complete a bachelor's degree in the classics at Christ Church at Oxford on a scholarship. And during his post-secondary education, he became very interested in other European cultures, specifically art, literature, and music. And he later suggested it was through music and then, and specifically through the works of their most famous composers, that he learned to feel what he called a special sympathy for various European nationalities. And he later made statements indicating that literature was another way in which he developed sympathy for various cultural groups. After he graduated, Gibbon considered joining the British Home Service or the Indian Civil Service, but instead he followed his heart and took an apprenticeship at the Black and White, which was an illustrated weekly newspaper in London. And so you can see here, this is just a clip from an early issue, 1898. And in 1900, he married Anne Fox, who was his beloved girlfriend called Nancy, and the two moved to the artist colony of Bedford Park. And after a period of illness and overseas travel and some more freelance journalism, Gibbon was hired by the Canadian Pacific Railway as a publicist in 1907. And his first assignment from the company president was to organize a tour of Canada for the editors of a dozen leading British newspapers. And this trip was really transformative for Gibbon. He was captivated by Canada, and when he returned to London, he asked his manager to allow him to go on what he called an educational trip to Canada each summer. I felt I must learn to know the Canadian way of life, he later wrote, and to ride on a Western saddle. Indeed, it was Western Canada in particular that made a significant impression on him. As he later put it, I began to realize that the prairies were Europe transplanted. This trip through the West threw new light on my vocation. I began to realize that the Canadian Pacific was not merely a railway carrying passengers and freight, but through its colonization work, helping to build up a new nation. I made up my mind to come out again and make a closer study of this nation building. So a subsequent project he was involved with was on the role of Scots in the development of Canada, and that led to the publication of his first book in 1911, which was simply titled Scots in Canada, and which was quite successful and sold about 16,000 copies. I can only hope that my book will have similar sales. But the process of researching and writing this book, he later remarked, had a definite influence on my outlook. I came to realize how much Canada owed to the Scots. With this historical background, I became more than ever reconciled to the prospect of making Canada my future home. It would not be a foreign land. So it was that in 1913, when he received the offer to move to Montreal and manage all of CPR's advertising, he immediately accepted. He worked very quickly, and by the following year, he had a house constructed, and he sent for Nancy and their 3 children, Murray and Faith and John, and their 4th child, Philip, would be born later that year. So in these early years, Gibbon threw himself headlong into his work. He was often traveling to visit the CPR offices in the United States by rail, but the outbreak of the First World War severely limited immigration to Canada, and this gave him time to seriously contemplate and plan for the realities of post-war immigration to Canada. So you can see here, just going back to this chart, there's a massive drop-off in immigration, and a lot of the debates continued because a lot of people figured that as soon as the war ended, which everyone thought would end quickly, there would be a boomerang effect, that they were just going to be the same dramatic levels. And obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see it didn't happen to the same degree, but the anxieties about Canada's immigration and assimilation policies didn't really abate in this period, but there was a lot of thought continued to be put into them, and Gibbon was part of that. So he made a number of trips to the United States and bought books on the racial situation there, as he put it. He also made annual research trips to the prairies and to British Columbia. And he explained that the purpose of all this study was to understand what was likely to happen in Canada with the post-war influx of European immigrants who he thought may want to go to the United States but wouldn't be able to find land there. And he was very pragmatic about this. A lot of people thought, the return boom would be automatic. He said, look, there's going to be a shortage of ships. The repatriation of soldiers is going to take precedence. So there's not going to be a big immigration wave until at least a year after the war's end. And also, a lot of people thought there would be a return of high levels of English immigration. He said, even before the war, the English government was taking measures to limit immigration. So this is unlikely to happen. What's really likely to happen is there's going to be another huge boom of post-war immigration from continental Europe. And shortly after the end of the war in 1919, Gibbon also recognized another important fact, which is that the nationalism that had emerged in Canada during the war years could very easily shade into xenophobia, which is a fear or hatred of foreigners. And so he devoted considerable thought to what he called the problem of the foreign-born, who were likely to constitute the bulk of the post-war wave of immigration. And some specific groups he mentioned would be Italians, Germans, Mennonites, Scandinavians, Slavic peoples, and Jewish peoples. And in an article on the subject that he published in the Queen's Quarterly, he expressed a vision of cultural pluralism that called for linguistic and political assimilation, but allowed for some degree of cultural retention. And so this is kind of the point form of it here. So when they arrived in Canada, immigrants had a responsibility to conform to the laws, to send their children to school, and to take an interest and pride in the new country. And Canadians, in turn, had to ensure that immigrants felt welcomed, to provide them with good and cheap education, and to protect them from unfair exploitation. And Gibbon added that he saw nothing wrong with a foreign-born expressing their cultures through folk songs and crafts, which he noted, quote, under more sympathetic treatment are being revived. But despite the generally tolerant message of the article, there was some casual anti-Semitism that portrayed Jewish people as exploiting new immigrants and themselves being quite difficult to assimilate. In 1923, Gibbon delivered a similar paper to the Royal Society of Canada, which countered the popular idea in Canada at this time that European immigration was hindering the development of a distinctly Canadian culture. So this talk was entitled European Seeds in the Canadian Garden. And in it, he argued that by looking to the experiences of Europe and America, it was clear that immigrants could actually help a first-rate literature develop. So we then turned to the question of if there was the situation was similar in Canada, or if there were, if immigration was, quote, bringing any such human seeds from Europe into the Canadian literary garden. And so he gave another brief overview of the main groups and these European groups. And this time he put Jewish peoples in a more positive light. And some other evidence shows that in the next few years, he very intentionally reached out to Jewish audiences, which suggested an intentional move away from past anti-Semitism. And his conclusion in this paper was that ultimately, while most European immigrants were lower class or peasants, they were quickly becoming educated, they showed great promise, and they might, quote, add richness and color to the present somewhat monotonous Canadian literary garden. He went on to say that the real danger was that the materialism and prosperity worship rampant in North America would destroy the poetry and the artistic impulse that immigrants brought with them. And in an updated version of this talk given 6 months later, he more fully explained his title. So I'm quoting this at length, but this summer I found in a hitherto neglected corner of my garden a beautiful cluster of hollyhocks. Where they came from, I do not know. I did not plant them. Their seeds may indeed have been dumped into that corner in the most unromantic way, hidden in a load of manure. But there they were, and by pruning off superfluous leaves and giving a little attention, they grew to be the most beautiful flowers in that garden. Now, in the immigrant races, we have just such flowers in the possibility, of just such flowers in the Canadian literary garden. People who in their own country, even though they were illiterate peasants, enjoyed the possession of rich treasures of folklore and folk song, peasants who in their arts and crafts show a deep feeling for harmonious form and color, men and women and children eager to learn the language of the country that has given them refuge from the tragic circumstances of Europe, and surely ready someday to express their thoughts and aspirations in language which shall not perish. So here he's saying, European immigrants to Canada, even if they come as if in a load of manure, they could still bloom and become beautiful citizens and furnish the nation with colorful folk art. So long, of course, as they learned the imperishable language, which for Gibbon was English, all these newly replanted folks required was a little pruning and a little attention. And Gibbon determined to give them just that. Well, that is the attention. And so aside from giving lectures like these, Gibbon soon created a larger project to draw attention to Canadians of European descent and specifically their contributions to Canadian culture. And so this started as a single event and soon turned into a series of folk festivals, which have since been described by historians as, quote, pioneering efforts in a North American context, among the first, if not the first, on the continent. And so the very first was a folk song and handicraft festival dedicated to French culture and organized as an early spring attraction for the CPR's Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. And from this followed 15 more events. And so you can see here, fully half of these, those highlighted in gray, were dedicated to English or Scottish cultures, such as a Highland gathering held at Banff. But several of the others were quite path-breaking in their celebration of continental European cultures. And one that's particularly noteworthy is the new Canadian festival held in Winnipeg in 1928, which I've highlighted there. And here's an advertisement for it in the newspaper. You note it says it's 15 racial groups in picturesque costumes, songs, and dances will be present. This particular festival ran into significant opposition from critics who charged that the CPR, in Gibbon's words, quote, had no right to encourage immigrants to be anything but good Canadians. And Gibbon pushed through this opposition in part by collaborating with popular novelist Ralph Connor, and ultimately the festival went off without a hitch rather, but the press paid attention to this controversy around it. So as one journalist put it, what has been termed Canada's Nordic complex produced a very apathetic attitude toward the festival at first, before word of the unique entertainment spread and interest eventually grew. Still, some remained ambivalent and even disgusted by the event's end. So a writer in the Winnipeg Free Press described the festival in this way. So blazing in colors, the Hotel Rotunda presents a motley scene. Garbed in seemingly grotesque clothes of many bright hues, the European mingles with the conservatively clad Westerner. The new Canadian seems perfectly at home in this setting, for it is that of his native land. But the Westerner is bewildered. There are many things that arouse his interest. So despite this, the festival no doubt convinced some English Canadians that continental European immigrants had something of value, and Gibbon was hopeful and confident that it had. One unique aspect of the original folk festival held in Quebec City was its inclusion of Indigenous peoples. And this was in part due to the CPR's past success in utilizing Indigenous peoples and their cultures to promote regional tourism, most notably in Western Canada. And it was there that Gibbon encountered this type of project. So one of the most prominent examples is that of the Indian Days Festival held in Banff. And this event sometimes gets lumped in with the CPR festivals organized by Gibbon in the 1920s, but the reality is a bit more complicated than that. So after Banff National Park was created at the insistence of the CPR, the CP constructed the Banff Springs Hotel, and when it was completed in 1888, it was one of the most luxurious in North America. In 1894, a spring flood washed out a section of the railway lines, leaving some guests stranded at the hotel. And so local guide Tom Wilson had the idea to travel to nearby Morley and convince a group of Nakota people to come and stage an event for the tourists. And so this is how Indian Days began, although they weren't actually established as an annual independent event until 1911. It begins as a single-day affair. As they grow in popularity, it increases to 2 days in 1912 and 3 days in 1928. And once it was formally established, it was sponsored and publicized by the Canadian Pacific, although it continued to be largely organized by local entrepreneurs like Tom Wilson, Norman Luxton, and Jim Brewster. And the event was particularly remarkable due to the fact that Nakota had been intentionally excluded from the park since its creation. And, you know, obviously their involvement in this event was complex, and there was you know, some issues. So for instance, I think the caption of these images kind of speaks to how some tourists viewed it. So they said, you know, Indians from Morley are all dressed up for the pleasure of the tourist, which contrasts with the way that many Nakota people view the event. So according to one historian, owing to their long history of gatherings in the region, Nakota peoples do not consider Indian Days an event with a distinct starting point or separate from previous gatherings and established cultural practices. And there's some interesting evidence to suggest that although, you know, there was a lot of stuff happening, you know, in the tourist gaze, the kind of after hours behind the scenes moments were when a lot of Nakota would continue to practice traditional ceremonies and things like this out of the public eye. And this is quite remarkable in this period due to the fact that the Canadian government was very actively attempting to suppress and indeed stamp out any expressions of traditional Indigenous cultures. So this is quite a remarkable event. And so the Banff region specifically has this kind of long, unique, and complex history of settler engagement with Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And there's also photographic evidence to suggest that Indigenous peoples had been involved in other local events in Banff, even though they're not written about as much, including the annual Winter Carnival. So you can see here some snapshots from someone's photo album. You see through the ice archway, there are teepees set up all the way down Banff Avenue. And then you can see more clearly here in these images from the following year, some Nakota chiefs are at the forefront of the festivities at this day at the Ice Castle, and there's quite a large crowd gathered to see them. So early on, Gibbon took note of the commercial potential of Indigenous cultures and began working to more broadly publicize Indian Days. And so in late 1922, he convinced Canadian anthropologist Marius Barbeau to write a book about the event, one intended in Gibbon's words to, quote, create a popular interest in the Indians. The result was entitled Indian Days in the Canadian Rockies, and it was published in 1923. Gibbon also began trying to include Indigenous peoples in additional events. So in July 1923, for instance, there was a notable Indigenous presence at the official opening of the Banff-Windermere Highway. On this occasion, the official party departed from the Banff Springs Hotel in the morning, stopped at the Kootenay Crossing for the official ribbon cutting and a luncheon, and then descended in the town of Invermere, where the press reported that Kootenay Indians greeted the lieutenant governors of Alberta and British Columbia. Their chief Paul addressed the crowd through his translator, John Longtime Star, and the officials then expressed their appreciation and promised to attend a powwow, which was going to be held that evening. That night, 5 tribes of the Kootenay gathered at Lake Windermere for the celebration and were welcomed in their own language by Lieutenant Governor Nicol, who had also donated prize money for a stampede. And so, inspired by these past successes, when Gibbon began planning his folk festival at Quebec, he worked to include an Indigenous component. And what he ultimately ended up doing is recruiting some Huron-Wendat peoples from the nearby Wendake Reserve to come and perform a number of songs and dances at the festival. So you can see from this program from the festival, some of the songs and dances were religious or Christian pieces, but others were earlier traditional ones. One of the things that's a bit odd about the festival is that not all Indigenous content was provided by Indigenous peoples themselves, nor did all the content actually relate to the Indigenous people that lived in that region. So for instance, you can see here on the right-hand page that Canadian soprano Juliette Gaultier also performed what the program called, quote, Eskimo, Nootka, and Kootenai songs. So overall, we should also not lose sight of the fact that Indigenous content was not intended to displace the emphasis on French folk culture, given that the festival was advertised abroad as a celebration of the first white man's music in America. So this was an interesting, somewhat complex engagement with Indigenous cultures, but the second festival in Quebec differed from the first in that the Indigenous component was eliminated on account of mixed reviews. So writing to Juliette Gaultier, Gibbon explained that there would be no Indigenous in the subsequent festival, writing, "We have kept out the Indian and Eskimo music from Quebec this year because there are so many more folk melodies available and our time is limited. The few Indians last year were generally considered to be disappointing, and without their participation, there is no longer the same excuse for introducing Indian music. The Eskimo music has also lost the charm of novelty at Quebec." So all the cultural festivals that Gibbon organized, of course, were at root intended to drive business to the CP, to the railways, and to the hotels. But his treatment of Indigenous peoples was different than his treatment of continental Europeans. With the Europeans, Gibbon was really committed to trying to promote pluralism or mutual understanding and appreciation of their cultures, even working against criticism and opposition. But Indigenous peoples were seemingly only brought in to serve as an additional attraction, one that could be discarded once their novelty had worn off, and in this case, is supposedly because of some poor reviews. And there was a similar disparity in how Gibbon approached European versus non-European immigrant groups. And that is to say, it's quite striking that no Canadians of African or Asian descent were present in any of the festivals he organized, which therefore kind of positioned European cultures as the only ones worthy of celebration. And this can't have been an accidental exclusion because Gibbon was familiar with a wide variety of non-European cultures. Remember, he's born in Sri Lanka. He takes a tour of Japan and finds it to be a country, quote, of extraordinary interest. He spent time in Algeria recovering from illness, and he was very familiar with Chinese poetry. And of course, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the CPA owed its existence to the labor of Chinese workers that the company cast off immediately after the construction was complete. Also, as a frequent traveler across Canada and the United States, Gibbon had no doubt been assisted countless times by porters of African descent. So the CP had copied the Pullman sleeping car service from America, and in America, African Americans traditionally staffed the sleepers, so the CP copied this aspect for their Canadian service as well. And according to historian Sarah Jane Matthew, by 1900, regular runs from Montreal to New York and from Toronto to Chicago featured sleeping and dining cars that were staffed exclusively by railroaders of African descent. And recall that, Gibbon is traveling to the United States very frequently during this period. And so through his constant travel and his immersion in popular culture, he was always going to concerts and to the theater. He was fully aware of racial minorities and common stereotypes about them, as his correspondence demonstrates. But even this limited pluralism represented a positive change for this era. Although the festivals often, quote, betrayed limited perspectives on the non-British ethnic groups in question, as one historian contends, they were groundbreaking in their efforts to exhibit pride in multi-ethnicity during a period in which cultural intolerance of immigrants from non-British backgrounds was optimal. Indeed, this was the case, and as many Canadians of British descent viewed continental Europeans as racially, which is to say quite literally biologically inferior to themselves, Gibbon's efforts to promote cultural pluralism were important, even if they were still limited by some of the same ideas about race and ultimately business-oriented at the end of the day. And this kind of progressive yet limited and business-oriented approach is most clearly seen in another one of his publicity innovations, which was a trail riding club intended to drive traffic to Banff. So Gibbon had routinely gone horseback riding on trails in the Rockies since 1909. But everything changed in 1923 when he and a number of other riders set out on a trip to visit the spectacular Wolverine Plateau. Upon arriving at the site, some of the riders, including Gibbon, decided to spend some additional time there while the others continued on to Banff. However, a blizzard set in and trapped the group there for 3 days. And so in his autobiography, Gibbon recalled that on the third morning, he got an idea to start an order of the trail riders of the Canadian Rockies, which he did. And this organization actually exists to this day. Here's a screenshot of their website from a couple days ago. And it would be very difficult to overstate how integral and important Indigenous peoples were to the success of this organization from the outset. And as this image shows, with the teepees prominently foregrounded there, right to the present day. Indigenous peoples worked as guides. They provided the teepees and the art and entertainment for the guests. They were also permitted to join as members. And so here's a group portrait of some of the Dakota guides that were participating in the trail rides in the 1940s. And then I refer to entertainment. So this seems to be one of the things that they would do, is they would have these packing competitions. So one of the guides here, Horace Holloway, is helping to pack, and it looks like with one of the trail riders. Here we have Gibbon in the center here, greeting 2 Nakota chiefs in 1941. It's another clipping from the Trail Riders Bulletin. It's called The Oldest Canadian Trail Rider. So this is a Mrs. Laughing Beaver, who is over 100 years old, the mother of 12 children, and rode 200 miles from Nordegg to Banff and returned in August of 1934 to celebrate one of their annual events. And here we have some images on their largest tent that they had for the celebrations at the end, the Sundance Lodge, and a close-up of some of the paintings. The photographs were taken by Charles Walcott, and the caption here says that they were designed and painted under the direction of Jonas Benjamin, chief walking in the grass of the Stoney Indian tribe. And this is 1924. So, so it's clear that they were a major part of this organization, and they were allowed to join as members because the original constitution that Gibbon drafted declared that membership in the order was open to all, irrespective of age, sex, creed, color, or profession. What's interesting, though, is that in his autobiography, he goes on to explain there were special reasons for the articles he included. So he says, the irrespective of age was put in because I knew an old lady who was a trail rider and who proposed to continue as such till she died. Race was inserted because I wanted to have at least one Indian chief in our membership. Creed was there in case anyone like Father De Smet, who pioneered through white man's past, should want to join us. This was a famous Catholic missionary. And color was intended to cover the case of the Negro butler, whom Dr. Charles Walcott, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, brought with him every summer from Washington to do the catering on his geological camping trips, and had 1,500 miles of trail riding to his credit. So this approach is non-discriminatory, but it's also, I think, not really intended to be anti-discriminatory, in that it didn't really address any of the underlying hierarchy. So, Gibbon recognized that First Nations chiefs would be a draw for the tourists. The ability to bring along an African-American butler would be a draw for wealthy American tourists, who were the primary target for this publicity venture. But the normative member was a white Protestant male, even if membership was open to all. And again, we can't forget that the creation of this organization was part of Gibbons' commitment to the CP to drive company revenues. And it's interesting, you can see in this brochure, they actually call it the Canadian Pacific Rockies. So obviously a lot of efforts going into promote tourism here. And Gibbon knows this. So in 1934, he's finally convinced the King of Siam, or now Thailand, to join them for a trail ride, knowing full well that the decision to ride longer than first planned meant $500 a day more to the hotel for the rent of the royal suite. And with inflation, this works out to about $9,300 a day in 2019 currency. But at the same time, it's worth remembering that not everyone was so welcoming during this period, even for the purposes of doing business. So another one of the CP's publicity schemes was a program whereby popular artists were invited to the hotel at Banff to paint the Rockies. So this local history book recounts the following anecdote involving one of the artists, the well-known German-born American wildlife painter Carl Runge. So in 1931, while making final preparations for a show of 4 local artists, Runge curtly dismissed from his presence a young man whom he took to be one of the Japanese bellboys. Only later did Runge learn that the man had been an emissary from the Queen of Siam, visiting the hotel, who wanted to ask for a special showing for the Queen. The Queen never did visit the show. So this openness to European cultural diversity, but still the exclusion of non-European groups, is quite clearly seen in Gibbons' most famous work on the subject. And the story of the Mosaic begins in late 1937, when Gibbon is asked by the chairman of the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's board of directors, for suggestions for new programming. And quite naturally, he suggests a folk music series. He's quickly given the green light to proceed, and what he does is use the materials he had gathered for the folk festivals and quickly submits drafts of the series that he proposed be entitled Canadian Mosaic, Songs of Many Races. And the stated goal of this series, he said, was to create a better understanding of the contributions made by the various racial groups in Canada. And as we've seen with his past efforts, all these racial groups were considered white, mainly European. So French, Scottish, Irish, Scandinavian, Germanic, English, Ukrainian, Polish, Welsh, Russian, and Hebrew. You can also see from this chart, this series aired in January and February of 1938. It was a massive success, and it led publishers McClellan and Stewart to ask Gibbon to turn the series into a book, which was released that December to glowing reviews. And I can't help but remark on how impossible it would be to have that fast of a turnaround of publication in this day and age. Someone reading Canadian Mosaic, the book, would quickly grasp that in order to understand New Canadians, they had to understand race. Gibbon argued that Canadians had not yet fused into a single race with a shared physical appearance, one that could be identified at a distance. But it was clear he thought they would share one skin color. As he put it, quote, "This Canadian race of the future is being superimposed on the original native Indian races and is being made up of over 30 European racial groups, each of which has its own history, customs, and traditions." So given Gibbon's long involvement with the Nakota peoples of the Banff region, this statement is at face value quite perplexing, especially when we consider the fact that he was viewed as so significant that he was made an honorary chief by the Nakota just 6 years after the publication of this book. And I can only conclude that, they didn't read it. So the only thing I can figure here is there's a clue that's offered by another comment Gibbon makes in the book when he talks about the earliest human, the so-called Cro-Magnon man. And he says, an attractive reconstruction of his face and head have been modeled by a sculptor, J.H. McGregor. He looks very much like a Stoney Indian, and whenever I meet one particular Stoney chief at the time of the Indian days at Banff, I think of this Cro-Magnon and feel tempted to say, "Hello, old man, here we are again." Now, while Gibbon goes on to say that the skull and skeleton of the Cro-Magnon and the, quote, American Indian were very different, it's possible and very likely that Gibbon subscribed to the popular theory of the day, which scholars now refer to as the myth of the vanishing race. And this theory suggested that Indigenous peoples represented the lower stage of evolution and were slowly going extinct. Whether or not this was Gibbon's logic when he wrote these lines in Mosaic, it's clear that his personal ties with the Dakota didn't prevent him from writing them out of the story. It's clear from this statement in the book that he believed the Canadian Mosaic was going to tile over Indigenous peoples and didn't feel too many qualms about it. And in reality, this would be like tiling over an existing mosaic, for as Gibbon surely knew but didn't acknowledge, given as Indigenous people were and are equally diverse to Europeans in that each group has its own history and customs and traditions. But Gibbon's future mosaic was instead to be composed strictly of Europeans, or what he called, quote, foreign white stock. Thus, whether in a Canadian garden or Canadian mosaic, the inclusion and exclusion of peoples and their cultures was based not on geography or relationships or inputs from the groups themselves. Rather, the mosaic was determined by Anglo-Canadians' aesthetic tastes, shaped as they were by a number of pre-existing assumptions and even prejudices based on ideas about race and evolution. And this was a vision of cultural pluralism that struck a chord with the Canadian public. The book Canadian Mosaic was lauded nationwide. It garnered the interest of King George VI, and it won a Governor General's Literary Award. And Gibbon joked to the Canadian Authors Association, "I advise you all to win one of these medals, because if you do, people will read your books." So, I'm trying to take in his advice. The press reported that the book was widely acclaimed by British and Canadian critics for its compelling human interest, its sound scholarship, as an important contribution to the solution of a vital national problem, the problem of Canadian unity. And within months of its publication, the book and its metaphor were spreading across the country. And here's just a mosaic of reviews of the Mosaic. Politicians, activists, teachers, students, ministers, journalists, and editors began using this term. Women's and Young People's Association began studying this book as a guide to, quote, studying Canada's nationality problem. And various groups began self-consciously attempting to determine their place within the Canadian Mosaic. And of course, it took no time at all before Canada's Mosaic was being presented as an opposition to America's melting pot. So in short, there's never been a more popular metaphor for diversity in Canada than that of the Mosaic. And Gibbon's book was clearly what was responsible for its popularization. Gibbon had been scheduled to retire from his position at the CP in 1940, but the company asked him to stay on until the end of the Second World War. And so it was that he ended up being drawn into the federal government's official efforts to promote pluralism during wartime. And just a brief overview of what happened here. So at some point during the conflict, the federal government belatedly began paying attention to what they saw as the problem of minority European groups in Canada. And in so doing, because nothing had been done before, they called upon the expertise of men like Kirkconnell and England and Gibbon. And I go in a lot more detail about this in the final chapters of the book, but the short of it is that the government essentially accepted and publicized the visions of pluralism that these men had developed with all their racial limitations. And so, for instance, the Canadians All program, you can see here, which was produced in 1941, basically copied the format of Mosaic in that it consisted of a radio series first, and then a widely distributed pamphlet, which praised the contributions of various European immigrant groups. However, it ignored Indigenous peoples as well as Canadians of African and Asian descent, and instead stressed that Canadians were almost entirely of European descent. And indeed went on to argue that this was what would make national unity possible. And after some critical letters to the government and to the author, a second edition was issued, which did include some Indigenous content. Gibbon wasn't part of this project. I think it kind of followed his format, but he did later sit on the committee that was established that was brainstorming these sort of ideas, which was called the Committee on Cooperation and Canadian Citizenship. However, some of the ideas, actually none of the ideas that he ended up pitching to them came to fruition because the committee was very dysfunctional, and it was officially disbanded in January of 1945. And later that year, Gibbon retired. So there's not a lot that he contributes to this committee that makes it out. But the point is, and in the book, that the kind of vision of pluralism that he developed and that the others developed, Kirkconnell in England, and shared the limitations that it had and the purposes behind it, did actually become official efforts during this period, during war. And so later in 1945, Gibbon retired. Despite his expertise, he didn't weigh in on the ongoing and heated debates about immigration policy. Instead, he spends his time writing on an eclectic variety of topics, including the history of nursing and specifically the Victoria Order of Nurses, the history of the canoe, the city of Montreal, and Canadian handicrafts. So this is just a bit of a collage of some of the books that he published between his retirement and death. In 1952, he was hard at work editing his autobiography, but he was unable to have it published before he fell seriously ill that May. He nevertheless remained in good spirits and, though unable to write, continued to speak of future writing projects even on his deathbed. His condition deteriorated quickly and he died on the 2nd of July. Some years later, a co-worker suggested that during his life, Gibbon had no friends, just business acquaintances. Whether or not this is true, I think that he formed some of his closest relationships with people in Western Canada. It seems that whether hiking or trail riding, he felt most at peace when he was in the Rockies. And I think it's therefore fitting that he was buried in Banff, the region that he loved so dearly. His widow, Nancy, lived for another 4 years, and she is buried over 3,000 kilometers away in a cemetery near their St. Anne de Bellevue home. And outliving them both is the Mosaic metaphor, which is with us Canadians still. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. That was a lovely presentation. If there's anyone out there who has any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'd love to address them.
While we wait, I'll put one more slide up I had of a few years later, there was a memorial for Gibbon that was put up by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. And so this is just a picture from that. Didn't really fit, but I wanted to show it as well. It's quite a striking photo.
I think that's up at the Banff Center. It's still up at the Banff Center.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I don't think I actually made it up to see it when I was there, which is too bad, but I did count on coming back before COVID.
There's a question here from Don, I believe. Question is, how much was Pierre Trudeau's influence by Gibbon's books?
That is a good question and a tricky question to answer. So drawing a direct line from Gibbon or Kirkconnell or England for that matter to Trudeau's policy and announcement is difficult. I don't think it can be done, but I think that this early visions of pluralism did influence the policy of multiculturalism in pretty direct ways. So anticipating this question, the policy had a predominantly European focus. As the most famous philosopher of Canadian multiculturalism, William Lick has put it, multiculturalism is demanded by and designed for European groups. The policy emerges out of the debates about the B&B Commission, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, and basically, other European groups, specifically Ukrainian Canadians, reject this vision of Canada as having only 2 official cultures and languages, and they say there's more out there. There's than just English and French. So that's part of the history, and non-Europeans aren't specifically excluded from this policy. And actually, there's a lot of activism after the announcement to include anti-racist programming under the umbrella of multiculturalism. So there's an argument about afterwards about that there is a shift away from that. It does begin with an emphasis on folk culture. So when the government creates a council on multiculturalism in the early 1970s, the chairman is the head of the director of the Canadian Folk Arts Council, president of the Folk Arts Council of Manitoba. And when Gibbons giving his speech to the Ukrainian Canadian community, he specifically advised, to talk about this background. He quotes a famous poem that's been translated by Kirkconnell, and he gets advice about, kind of very, it's shocking to read this correspondence from the 70s, right? But very, patronizing stuff of like, Ukrainians are very simple people. You should mention their famous poet and kind of talk about their folk art and stuff. And so this is, we have documentary evidence of this. And the third thing is that the policy wasn't created with Indigenous people in mind. This is right after 1971, Trudeau and Chrétien proposed this white paper, which is basically to assimilate all Indigenous peoples into Canada by eliminating the Indian Act and treaties. And it's very controversial. It's pushed back, and Indigenous people reject it. And so there's this uneasy fit between Indigenous peoples and multiculturalism, because they really, the policy isn't created with them in mind. And there's an uneasy fit. Indigenous people have a different relationship with the crown than settlers do. It's quite, I think it's that simple. So a long answer to a pretty simple question, but so there isn't direct evidence that Trudeau is reading Gibbon's book, but the vision of pluralism that develops in this period, in the interwar period, I think we can see has a long legacy in influencing the later development of the official policy. But that's what my current research project is on. So I might have a more coherent answer in 2 years' time.
Thank you, Daniel. There's another question here in the Q&A. Perlan asks, fascinating talk, thank you. The intensity of the folk festivals in only 5 years is impressive. Any idea of how this work flowed through the hotels and of its business outcomes, so hotel stays and so on, as well as outcomes for the performers?
That's a really interesting question. I never was able to find really good financial evidence about the boosting, but I was able to say this, which is that Gibbons' immediate boss, in the early years at least, is this absolute spendthrift who just his management style was just humiliating people for making little mistakes and like just rooting out any source of excess and waste. And when you read Gibbons' letters and things, it seems like he has this very meandering and romantic approach to the work, right? It's fascinating reading his correspondence with Maris Barbeau about planning the festivals, because all their discussion is really about it, like it focuses so much on the quality of the music, and that's their main concern, getting the best performers, making sure it's a really good performance, and saying like, oh my gosh, I'm spending a lot of money. He says to Barbeau at one point, like, pray for me. And Gibbon's not religious, so it's kind of a joke, but also, he realizes he's spending a huge amount of money. So I think the best evidence that these efforts bore fruit is the fact that he was allowed to keep doing them. I think his bosses at CP would have shut them down if they weren't working very well. And in fact, some of the subsequent festivals are requested by managers of other hotels, or actually by provincial politicians, because they see the boom that these events are bringing. So that's a bit of the business side. And as for how it affected the performers, I'm not sure. One of Gibbons' less popular schemes, so he was bringing some really like highbrow music to the hotels in the region. And there's some interesting correspondence at the White Museum between some locals who kind of are, not so gently throwing shade at Gibbons' ideas, saying like, why is he bringing these opera singers and folks down here? Like, that's not what people want. They just want something simple. And so it's interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, but there's definite evidence to suggest that it was really beneficial for the performers that he was hiring. Everybody that participated got money, and they were very actively involved in making sure they had accommodations and that they were funded. And there's so much of their correspondence is dedicated to sorting out these sort of little issues of who can stay where, who should we bring, and we can't offend anyone. And so I think it was extremely beneficial for the performers from a financial perspective, because again, these were unprecedented events. Something like this had never been done. And so for the opportunity for amateur and professional to kind of appear together. It was it was good for them. Somebody was paying the bill.
Great, thank you. Okay. I don't see any more questions at this time. So, if there are any questions that come up later, you can always contact us and we can reach out to Daniel. But I would like to thank Daniel again for presenting tonight, and also like to mention that the book is in the White Museum shop and can be either purchased in person or online. I see one more question here. Oh, it's a thanks so much from Donna. Awesome. And so the book is available. And also quick mention that we do have a few events coming up in April, next week, and in May. And please check out our website at white.org/events to find out a little bit more. There is one more question that's popped up. So yes, a couple questions here. One I can answer, yes, the recording will be available, and it will be on the White Museum YouTube channel, and I can certainly send the link out to everyone that was here tonight. The other question is, Perlana is wondering why the emphasis on multiculturalism in 1941 in wartime. We'll do one more question and then we will say goodnight to everyone here.
Okay, yeah, I don't mind. That's great. Yeah, the multiculturalism in wartime is an interesting thing. There were a lot of concerns about the loyalty of minority European groups. So there's a similar situation, right, happened in the First World War. Canadians of German and Ukrainian descent were placed in internment camps because of concerns about their loyalty. And a similar thing happens in the Second World War, and even, very worse in the case of Japanese Canadians who have all their possessions taken and sold, and they're kept in camps as well. So that's the security aspect side of it, because it was done in the name of state security, although there's really no evidence to suggest there was any substantial threat at all. But in the case of the Second World War, the government was trying to avoid some of that, at least in the case of other European nationalities. And so they brought these experts on board basically to tell Canadians of British descent that there was national unity, and also to try to make sure that was the case, like to reach out to various European groups so that they would feel at home in Canada. There was some concern, that they would side with Hitler if promises were made that affected their homeland or something. And so one of the things I talk about a bit more in the book just is that there is a shift in cultural pluralism, what I call these ideas that came before official multiculturalism. So it shifts from not just celebrating diversity, but also really emphasizing political loyalty, like all these groups, you can retain your cultural differences, but you have to come together, behind the war effort. You stand with Canada, you stand with Great Britain. And so that was a little bit of where the focus came from. And one of the things that I talk a bit more about in the book too is just the fact that it's not a huge priority for the federal government. They do have this committee established, but not a whole lot gets done. And some historians have suggested that kind of the legacy is really that it sets up a bureaucracy that exists after the war, is transformed into the citizenship branch, and a lot of their early programming is very similar to what is done in the name of multiculturalism in the 70s. So there is kind of this direct line of continuity at a bureaucratic level, but in terms of it being a major emphasis, it really wasn't. There's a number of different civil servants who are concerned about it themselves, and they keep taking it to Prime Minister Mackenzie King, and he keeps saying, yeah, that seems important, but there's not really a lot of action on it. And as I alluded to in the talk, the committee itself is very dysfunctional. A couple of the members are very vocally anti-communist, and when Russia joins the war effort on the side of the Allies, that's a huge problem. And so the government's really trying to get these people to be quiet and get them off the committee. So it doesn't really have the most auspicious beginnings, but it came out of a concern of national unity most broadly, I guess would be the simple way to answer that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, once again. And we will say goodnight to everyone here. Thank you again for joining us. And great. Wish everyone a good evening and also a good coming weekend.
Thanks so much again.
Welcome. Good night.